That is Farage at his absolute weakest as a political performer. His absolute weakest. Because, at his strongest, he channels that indignation about serious matters. At his weakest, he can be thin-skinned, easy to offend, and nurtures a persecution complex that makes him seem eccentric.
Even back in those faraway days, Lewis, long before you were a twinkle in anyone's eyes, those jokes were out of bounds for all comedians. And so for kind of Nigel Farage to elide saying what I was doing was no different to the black and white minstrels or Till Death Us Do Part just doesn't withstand scrutiny. It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis. And this story, it doesn't seem to be going away, although it's not being covered perhaps as prominently in some places as it should be, which is something we might get onto. We've covered it on the newsagents for the last few weeks, this question of whether or not Nigel Farage was anti-Semitic to his Jewish classmates at Dulwich College in the 1970s. So just a recap, The Guardian published a story a couple of weeks ago which said had up to 20 people coming forward, former schoolmates, accusing Farage of using racist, anti-Semitic language, school slur at school, slurs, Nazi salutes, singing "Gas 'em all," making pro-Hitler remarks, telling minority students to go home. There is also a reference to a 1981 teacher's letter warning that the then young Farage had publicly professed racist and neo-fascist views. And you might remember, if you listened to our episode with Michael Crick, these aren't new allegations, contrary to what we just heard from Richard Tice there. This was reporting that was done, 12, 13 years ago by Michael Crick, then at Channel 4. They have re-emerged, more people have come forward, and Reform over the last few weeks have gone from minimising it to saying it didn't really happen to today we see Tice explicitly saying that it's all made up and it's twaddle.
It is a very peculiar place to land up in for the deputy leader of Reform, because Nigel Farage has been trying to find his answer to why these allegations have surfaced, as you say, over a decade ago the first time. And when he was cornered by Michael Crick and asked about them, he said, was I an idiot as a schoolboy? Yes, I was. Am I racist now? No, I'm not. You can make of that what you want. When The Guardian resurfaced and interviewed more people who corroborated Michael's account, then it became harder to ignore. And of course, Nigel Farage was at this stage more prominent. He was the leader of a party. He fully expects to become Prime Minister at the next election. And so his response this time round was, I think, a little bit more guarded, right? It was more of a politician's answer than it was a sort of, a kind of what I call a UKIP leader's answer, which is, oh, get on with it, it's all fine, don't believe it, all the rest of it.
He said he'd been a Bolshevik teenager.
He said he'd been a Bolshevik teenager. Yeah, exactly. But I think Tice has just shifted the dial quite significantly by putting the blame back on those making the claims. So we have now got grown men who were schoolboys at the time recalling the anti-Semitic abuse of Nigel Farage at Dulwich College. And Richard Tice is able to say, they've made it up. It's twaddle. It's left-wing twaddle. I mean, does he not believe people who are bringing forward allegations of anti-Semitism all round? Or is it just these ones because they affect Nigel Farage?
So there should be an easy template to deal with all of this, which is, I was a kid, I was stupid, I said obnoxious things, and I'd like to apologise to anyone who, I offended at the time, and with hindsight now I can see that, I was a bit of a jerk. It's quite straightforward, and I think that anyone would kind of forgive you for that, because God knows, we've all done things when we were 15 or 16, which we think, oh God, looking back on that now, you feel it's an idiot. But there is also, as they've reached the position which they now have, there is just this logical inconsistency between what they're saying, which is, these guys, how can they remember that far back what Nigel Farage said at the same time as saying Nigel Farage didn't say it? Well, hang on. If Nigel Farage didn't say it, Nigel Farage does remember. But these kids, these 20 people who all corroborate each other's stories, don't remember accurately. You can't have both. And that is the sort of impossibility, I think, of where reform is ending up now, where you just think, well, hang on, but Nigel Farage does remember not saying this. That's interesting, and you can't reconcile it.
No, and I think that I think what Emily's saying is exactly right, which is that, look, it is actually, I think we're getting to a place which is more serious now, that what Richard Tice has done today is not just say, to use that expression from the Queen, the late Queen, recollections may vary, and you sort of say, well, as you say, John, look, but obviously if I did say anything that offended, I'm sorry, I don't recall all of this, it was a long time ago, etc., etc., etc. But what Tice has done today, and this just builds on slowly the reform response, is to dismiss out of hand and accuse, indeed, of lying people who are coming forward with serious charges, serious allegations of anti-Semitism, which they themselves clearly feel deeply. They are being highly dismissive of these claims. And I note that, well, two things. First of all, many of the same parts of the press and commentators who have spent the last few years lecturing everybody else about not taking anti-Semitism seriously are curiously quiet on this question, or not just quiet, they are actively attacking those coming forward and the reporting that details their allegations. But likewise, unfortunately, for various reasons, accusations of anti-Semitism in politics on left and right have become more commonplace over the last 10 years. And I would just say, if, for example, I don't know, at the height of the anti-Semitism allegations in the Labour Party, if John McDonnell, for example, had just gone on when Jeremy Corbyn was leader on the airwaves and just said, this is just a load of twaddle. We're not listening to it. We don't believe it. We don't accept it, blah, blah, blah. Now, there were some people who did those sorts of things and they were rightly excoriated because they were saying, look, even if you do not agree, even if you personally do not agree with what they do not believe you have done or meant to do, what these people have interpreted, clearly these people and their feelings about this ought to be taken seriously, no matter how long ago it was.
I also think, to that very point, these are not uncorroborated, they're not unsubstantiated.
When it's not just one person.
It's not one person who's come
people
out suddenly. Michael Crick was doing work on this. He then was the author of a biography on Nigel Farage. When Michael Crick was reporting this, he went to speak to the teachers at Dulwich College. He saw evidence, he saw letters, he saw people recommending that Nigel Farage not be made a prefect because of his past behaviour. And, to your point, I think it's not like a schoolboy chant, age 11. He was getting on for 18 at this point. 17, 18 is the year when you become, part of the pupil leadership team if you're going to be made a prefect. That is the last year of school. So to sort of somehow pretend that Farage would have had no idea what gas them all meant or the ramifications of a phrase like that, I think is probably stretching it. But yes, I think this has put them on a collision course with where they want to position the Reform Party. And, people to the right have, I think, for the last few years been in the mindset of, the protests are bad, Muslim protests are bad, Muslims, are questionable in what they are doing to the fabric of society. We've heard this time and again, and that is why we need to support the Jews. I think we've long said that actually anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are quite often bedfellows of the same mindset. You end up sort of revealing what you think about both when you start on one quite often. And for me, this just suggests that they've put themselves in a really complicated position now, which is, did you think you would be the establishment party? Did you think you'd be the pro-Israel party? Did you think you'd get, the sort of people who were shocked at Corbyn sort of coming to reform because they thought you were a respectable party who wouldn't be anti-Semitic, who would make, Jews feel at home in your party? What message does that send out now? I think it's a really critical moment, actually.
I think it's very interesting the way that the position, and Lewis, you kind of sketched it out, of how their line has evolved since, the accusations first came. I feel they are in full Donald Trump mode, which is, you know, when Donald Trump was accused by E. Jean Carroll, he accuses her back and goes on television saying, look, good-looking guy like me, do you think I'm going to go for a woman like that? You must be bloody joking.
E. Jean Carroll, who accused him
of rape in a department store. And, so when
and
women...
subsequently won a huge amount on damages from him when he defamed her afterwards.
So when Donald Trump is accused, he goes after the accuser.
Yeah.
And that is exactly where Richard Tice has ended up today, which is, and it's very 2025, that you don't ever admit that you've done anything wrong. It must be the person who's accusing you is a liar. Just one other thing that I would add to that, and it's something that we heard in that clip at the introduction of the show. Look, if you have been the victim of anti-Semitism, that is going to be seared on your brain about when someone was really vile to you and said hideous things to you. And, the person who's saying it probably doesn't remember that well because it doesn't seem a big deal to them to say something like that. Whereas, if you are a minority and someone uses an offensive slur or, says that there weren't enough gas ovens in Nazi Germany, then frankly, you're not going to forget that.
In the 1970s as well, when those events were very, very present, only sort of 25 years before.
I'm of a similar vintage. In the 1970s, when that was happening, you still had your grandparents alive who had survived all of this and had escaped, from Nazi Germany. And the idea that this would just be dismissed as playground banter. I mean, I think, Emily, you're right. I think at the age of 17 or 18, you kind of know what you're doing. Yeah.
I mean, you're about to enter the working world, to all intents and purposes.
But I think, John, you're completely right to sort of invoke the Trump comparison, because I think this is what's kind of most disturbing about this story. I mean, one of the disturbing things is the fact that basically we've got to a point in our politics now where, a lot of people, not just one person, not just two people, but 20 people can come forward with corroboration and make these claims that are serious of a form of racism, and it just be so breezily dismissed. I think that's problematic. But also, as you say, that instead of engaging with it and finding a position which would have been more reasonable, to simply dismiss it as slurs and smears and so on. Because I think two things can be true at once. I do think that actually, your school day, there probably ought to be some statute of limitations in these things in politics. I do think school days, we are sort of scraping the barrel a little bit, bringing and invoking those things. I think you should be allowed a sort of life before you go into politics and to say things that you would regret now. But that is the key point. You have to regret them now. You have to accept it, and you have to get to a position where if you have done wrong, and we should say again, he denies it, but these people clearly feel it, apologise to them. I was thinking a lot of my Sunday show on LBC this weekend. I interviewed George Aberoni. If you remember that, this is the guy, the president-elect of the Oxford Union, right? Who made that stupid comment in a private WhatsApp group where he basically said he was glad that Charlie Kirk was dead. This was then leaked, and his reputation, his name, I mean, it went all over the world. You had everyone from the MAGA right down, all over the US, UK, tweeting about him, basically, calling him everything under the sun, suggesting he's a DEI person getting into Oxford. He ended up being subject to a lot of racism. Here's just a clip of him on my show on Sunday.
You can be very specific and very deliberate in making distinctions to the fact that, there is that fair criticism of me, and there should be a space to have that fair criticism of me, and, be responsible in how we go about that in consideration of the fact that, I am still a student. But then I think we can also be fair in calling out what has also been a lot of kind of just racist and classist vitriol based on the fact that I'm a black person, the fact that, I'm a student at Oxford. And I think, we can be deliberate in splitting apart the two things.
Did you receive threats of violence against you?
Yeah.
Threats?
Yeah, I received threats of violence. My family did, my friends did. And, it was a very difficult time, I think, not just for me, but also realizing that, my mistake has not only impacted my life, but could impact other people's lives and impact even just broader communities, around me. And that was kind of a scary time, not just for me, but also in understanding, I guess, the responsibility that I bore as kind of a student leader in some capacity. I would hope that all of us are kind of able to take away from this a lesson perhaps in how we talk about politics online, and that, perhaps we should move away from this kind of incitement of reaction and this kind of inflammatory nature of political discourse, and perhaps look towards kind of more empathy within our politics, perhaps look towards more kind of collaborative discourse when we talk about politics.
And so you can hear there, like, you know, he is genuinely contrite. You know, he's genuinely contrite. He really regrets what he said. It was, you know, he's 20 years old. He's an adult. He should be held accountable to that. But nonetheless, the key point is that he has accepted wrong. And many of the same people who are dismissing what Farage is alleged to have done as completely immaterial and irrelevant because he was a young man and who cares and it's just scraping the barrel, etc., are the same people who are absolutely willing to slam
Furious.
Aberonier, furious at Aberonier, despite the fact that he's accepted, fessed up, said he did something wrong and has apologised for it.
Can I just take us back to where we started? The full circle of this, and I think it's to your point, that people don't seem to mind, don't seem to notice, don't seem to recognise that complete dislocation between the two stories. Nigel Farage has just received, or the Reform Party I should say, has just received a £9 million donation from a leading, I think it's cryptocurrency investor. He previously rolled the Brexit Party. His name is Christopher Harborne. And this is a record donation. It's the largest amount that any liver person has ever given to a British political party. And you have to sort of step back from this and say, well, how did that 9 million come in right now? Is that somebody who just goes, I don't care, you know, I don't believe this. I don't care what accusations there are. I don't really mind how Farage is seen. I don't really care if he might be racist or if he might be anti-Semitic, because we're getting to a place where, you know, if Labour I think if the Tories did anything like that, then the investments would drop. Whereas with Reform, it seems to go the other way. It's like, jolly good. OK, on we go.
Well, I think that Reform is in a position now where a lot of people think it is the alternative to the Conservative Party. And I think the Conservative Party is done. I'm going to put my money into Reform. You talk about this 9 million donation, which is the biggest donation in British political history and therefore remarkable. There is also a smaller donation of 50,000, which I would argue is even more significant, and it's come from Lady Rothermere. Who's she? Wife of the owner of the Daily Mail. And so are we seeing a realignment of the right-wing newspapers to get behind Reform and to abandon the Conservative Party, which would be a seismic change if you've suddenly got the Telegraph and the Mail?
I mean, arguably 50,000 is peanuts compared to the Mail's endorsement, which presumably comes next.
But just at the moment as well, of course, where Rothermere is in pole position to buy the Telegraph and create, you know, consolidate his media position as easily the most powerful media player in the British print press. If he were able to control both the Daily Mail, which remains enormously influential, and the Telegraph, which is very influential on, certainly historically, on the Conservative Party, but also increasingly digitally. I mean, the reason Rothermere would probably want to buy the Telegraph for many reasons. One of them is that, you know, it's got a big subscriber base that they can build on, which the Daily Mail hasn't got, because the Daily Mail has chosen, perhaps as a mistake now, but to go for the sort of, you know, free kind of model online and advertising. So, you know, you could be looking at a sort of new behemoth being created in the British media landscape, which is throwing its weight behind Reform, which would be no small thing.
And to your point earlier, this will then influence, I mean, this will determine what we as a country actually learn about in terms of news. There are very few websites, news sites, that are covering Richard Tice's remarks this morning. It's just The Guardian, who thinks of itself as the leader of the story. I don't think even the BBC has written it up. As
I can't see anything on the BBC News website. As you say...
It was their interview.
Yeah, it was their interview, and yet there is nothing. And I think that to be, you know, and I don't like to say this in particular, but, you know, I think that it's fair to say that with regards to this story, you know, the BBC has been nowhere really. And, you know, I think we see this as a bit of a pattern with Reform, and I can understand their angst about it, but that is a problem. And I think at the same time, I think actually the way you can contrast it is the only place that is doing some, or one of the only places which is doing some great work on Reform locally are BBC local news reporters. There's a great story today in Staffordshire about potentially racist remarks that the local council leader there has made about David Lammy. That's a, you know, BBC local reporting. That is going on locally because BBC often is some of the only kind of real local reporters left, with the hollowing out of regional newspapers. But nationally, I mean, come on, this is a this was a
It was
great
on their
interview.
flagship show.
A great
Yeah.
Great interview, great line, and yet on the BBC News website, I can't see it anywhere. Indeed, when I just look up Richard Tice on sort of Google News at the moment, I see Guardian, see ITV have reported on it. But apart from that, it's pretty much like, it's just positive stuff from GB News, The Express, all of the rest of it, and so on. So, the Guardian are ploughing a bit of a lonely furrow.
I don't know whether it's timidity or a loss of confidence or a feeling. I just don't know, or whether it's just kind of cock up that no one was really listening at 7:15 this morning when this was on. I know you're pulling a face at me, and I think you're absolutely right to. But why hasn't it? It's a good story, isn't it? I mean, we think it's kind of fascinating.
Again, I'm sorry. Is go back to the period, when I was in the lobby in the sort of 2017, 2018, with regards to Labour and anti-Semitism. That was a huge story. It was covered everywhere, ubiquitously, day after day. Now, I think you could make an argument to say that there were, problems around anti-Semitism, at least to some extent, that were more endemic, certainly in the grassroots of the Labour Party, or elements of the grassroots of the Labour Party at the time. But we are talking about the leader of the party here, and we're talking about, 20 people who have come forward. Again, he denies it. But that's serious, right? I mean, either one's serious, or they're both serious, or neither was serious.
And the point is that Richard Tice said we have done more than anyone to combat anti-Semitism. And the interviewer just
Well,
says...
that does sound like Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, you can't have it both ways.
No,
Are
exactly.
you listening to Jews who tell you that they faced anti-Semitism, or are you saying we've done more to combat... You can't have it both ways.
But
You
the
can't
sad
say
thing
that's
is
twaddle.
they can, can't they?
Well,
That's
they
the
can.
problem. They
They
can,
can.
and they are, and they do, and they're not being held to account for it.
And I suppose my question to that is that, yes, it's very Trumpian. Yes, that works very well in MAGA-land. Does it work so well here? I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer to that question.
It does if people don't ever learn about it.
Yeah,
That's
it does
the
if
point.
exactly.
That's
If-
why. I
if
mean,
no one's
we're
covering
not
it.
just weighing on in sort of tummy button examining detail about various media outlets. It's not really about, the place that we used to work or the papers that you do or don't read. It's genuinely about who gets to learn about this stuff, right? Because, I was surprised after just to carry this on, after the Michael Prescott whole case, the dossier that he wrote about the Panorama
Yeah, he was the editorial advisor on the editorial advisory board of the BBC.
and he made a big deal about the Panorama edit and the taking of one bit of Trump's speech and matching it with another bit of Trump's speech without any indication that it hadn't been part of the same sentence. When he wrote his report, he elided 2 bits of Trump's speech in the same paragraph. This was a story broken by James Ball at the paper that used to be called The New European. I think it's now called The New World. And when I saw that, I thought, oh, well, that's going to go everywhere. I mean, that's quite explosive. If the guy who is shown up to be a hypocrite, the guy at the centre of the whole story is shown up to be a bit of a hypocrite because he's done exactly the same thing. That story did not go anywhere. No one would report it. It didn't even pop up in The Guardian. I don't genuinely understand why nobody was covering that story. But it does, and it wasn't even taken up by the select committee, by the MPs. So I guess the point is, this stuff matters because it does influence the storytelling narrative of how we get to know our politicians.
It does.
If you don't hear about it, then your mind is stuck in an old narrative.
And I felt exactly the same way, John. I think you did as well. When we covered it on the newsagents, but when the BBC decided to excise a line from the Reith lecture this year, which basically said that Donald Trump was the most corrupt president in US history, and then it was removed on legal advice. Again, I think we both thought that this was a major story that would get more traction because it was clearly showing that the BBC on some level is being cowed by the White House on its coverage of the White House, despite the fact, by the way, where has that lawsuit gone? I think that we're 10 days on from the deadline now. Nothing. Wait, you weren't talking bullshit, were you, Don?
Look, Venezuela won't invade itself.
No, well, quite, exactly. But again, it sort of goes nowhere. I think it is, this is what I just think, this is the fundamental thing I just think about the story, which is, what I can't sort of get my head around with it is I can understand newsrooms initially being a bit like, this did happen a long time ago. Are we going into schoolboy stuff, etc., etc.? I can understand that initial reaction because I had it myself. And to some extent, I still have it. And as I say, you can think 2 things at once. You can think that and then think the reaction from the party poses substantial questions and they are making it a bigger story, or they ought to be making it a bigger story in their reaction than perhaps even if even the substance might suggest.
I should just say we're recording this at 1:10, and it's possible that by the time you're listening to this, it is everywhere. It is all over the front pages of everywhere.
Yeah,
but as we record, I'm just looking down the list here. The Guardian's reported it, ITV has reported it, Jewish News has reported it, and GB News has reported it. Richard Tice rejects nonsense claims Nigel Farage was anti-Semitic at school after Kemi Badenoch demands an apology. So there you go. 4 outlets. Maybe that will be different.
I'm sure they'll take
by
the cues from
tomorrow.
the newsagents. Just to say, by the way, just on the donation, because it is massive, like you say, John. They got 10 million in donations in the third quarter, 1 quarter this year. Tories got 4.5 million, Labour got just under 2 million. So they are pulling in serious cash.
But
Farage has
one
said,
person. I mean, that's the only thing I'd say. Okay, 2. Claudia Rothermere and the ex-Tory. But when it does skew it, if one person comes in and gives a donation of 9 million, it does make it look like their fundraising is incredibly successful, whereas it might just be one very rich person.
It sends a
signal to the establishment
Yeah.
that they are, it's bankable. That's where the money should be going, and people like to think they're backing a winner, and that's what they will be doing.
And it couldn't come at a better time, because in the run-up now to those elections in May, Wales, Scotland, local elections, biggest democratic event this side of the next general election, it couldn't come at a better time.
We'll be back after the break.
Right, we had thought that we were done with reform for the day, and the team were editing the podcast. John was about to go home, of course, because he always leaves early.
Oi, I'm here.
But actually, then we noticed at the corner of our eye who should appear on Sky News in one of his live press conferences, but Nigel Farage, where, among other things, he addressed the question of what happened on the BBC this morning, and indeed these allegations. And it was an extraordinary, I think it's fair to say, rant.
Can I just ask you say open to anything? Can I ask just about something different?
Yes, of course you can. My dear fellow, I would expect nothing less from our favourite national broadcaster.
Thank you very much. This morning, Richard Tice said on the radio, he was asked about the comments made by schoolmates of yours who had said that the comments you made they viewed as racist and offensive. He said that they were lying. You have said before that you did make comments, it made them banter, it wasn't correctly racial viewing. So Richard Tice is wrong.
I thought this morning's performance by one of your lower grade presenters on the Today programme was utterly disgraceful. I think to frame a question around the leader of Reform's relationship with Hitler, which is how she framed it, was despicable, disgusting, beyond belief. Are you surprised that 500,000 people every year refuse to pay the licence fee? But let me say this to you. The double standards and hypocrisy of the BBC are absolutely astonishing. At the time I was alleged to have made these remarks, one of your most popular weekly shows was the Black and White Minstrels, right? The BBC were very happy to use blackface. Oh, and not just in the Black and White Minstrels, you did it in It Ain't Half Hot Mum as well. And what about Alf Garnett? Do you remember what he called Marigold? Do you remember the word he used to describe Marigold on not live, but on primetime national TV? I better not repeat the word, otherwise you'll all use it and say that I used it. Homophobia? It ain't half hot, Mum. Are you being served? Oh, and what about Bernard Manning? Perfectly happy at exactly the same time for Bernard Manning to appear on primetime national BBC comedy, telling jokes for which these days you'd probably get a knock at the door from our thought police and perhaps get a 31-month prison sentence. I cannot put up with the double standards of the BBC about what I'm alleged to have said 49 years ago and what you were putting out on mainstream content. So I want an apology from the BBC for virtually everything you did throughout the 1970s and 80s. And I will respond to your direct question. I've received many letters over the course of the last few days from people that I was at school with. This one I think is particularly relevant. I was a Jewish pupil at Dulwich College at the same time, and I remember him very well. While there was plenty of macho, tongue-in-cheek schoolboy banter, It was humour. And yes, sometimes it was offensive, rather like most of the BBC's output, but never with malice. I never heard him racially abuse anyone. If he had, he would have been reported and punished. He wasn't. The news stories are without evidence except for belatedly politically dubious recollections from nearly half a century ago. Back in the 1970s, the culture was very different. Perhaps, Damon, you should reflect on that. Especially at Dulwich. Lots of boys said things they'd regret today, or just laugh at. Whilst Nigel stood out, he was neither aggressive nor a racist. If I can help in any way, let me know. And I've had plenty of those messages over the course of the last few days, and I'm sick to death of the double standards and hypocrisy, above all, of your organisation. And what happened on the Today programme this morning was a complete bloody disgrace. Next, Sam Coates from Sky News. No, I'm done with you, thank you.
Wow. And he wasn't done there. He then went on to read letters out from other people he'd been at school with, apparently including one Jewish boy who said that, you know, he may have kind of been involved in banter, but there was no malice involved.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't expect to hear...
the black and white minstrels.
No, or It Ain't Half Hot Mum mentioned. Do you remember what about Alf Garnett? What about him, Nigel? What about him? You know, do you remember what he used to call? Do you remember what he used to call her? No, we don't. We don't remember what he used to call Marigold, because nearly everybody who watched these shows is dead. This was. It's quite extraordinary, actually. I mean, an extraordinary run. I think, actually, there's two things to say about it. One is just going back to the conversation that we had, which is, again, this muddies the water actually even further, because actually he's saying something different to that which Tice said this morning on the matter of the substance, which is Tice said that it's all just a smear and all nonsense, all made up. Farage is basically, again, accepting that things were said, but it wasn't done, quote, with malice, which again is, fine. But then just say that and let that be the line. The other thing is, that is Farage at his absolute weakest as a political performer. His absolute weakest. Not in the sense that he's not deeply watchable, because he is, in a kind of like, what on earth is he doing kind of way. But because, at his strongest, he channels that indignation about serious matters, about substance, and he can be electric. At his weakest, he can be thin-skinned, easy to offend, and nurtures a persecution complex that makes him seem eccentric. And for him to turn around and argue that because the BBC was, broadcasting stuff that it probably wouldn't broadcast today in the 1970s and 80s, all of whom, like all the people involved, have, long since retired. The idea that somehow makes questions from BBC journalists today about his behaviour and what he said somehow void, just because, like, the producers of Z Cars were doing stuff back then, seems an outlandish prospect.
Well, Lewis, you said there's something which I have to take issue with quite profoundly, when you said that most of the people who watched those programmes in the 70s and 80s are now dead.
Well,
I am still, hopefully, quite alive. And let me just say this. I used to watch those programmes. I used to see, Till Death Us Do Part and
Like the Likely Lads,
Hot Mum and all the rest of it. They never made jokes about gassing Jews. Even then, they were different social mores, no doubt about it. What was being said then, what were the subject of jokes, the mother-in-law jokes you probably wouldn't get away with now. Some of the racist comments you wouldn't get away with now, quite rightly so. But at the same time, even back in those faraway days, Lewis, long before you were a twinkle in anyone's eyes, those jokes were out of bounds for all comedians. And so for kind of Nigel Farage to elide saying what I was doing was no different to the black and white minstrels or Till Death Us Do Part, just doesn't withstand scrutiny.
Yeah, it turns out they weren't doing Hitler gags on Crackerjack very regularly. And it is worth saying the BBC has apologised for some of that output in the past, and clearly sort of times have changed. But as I say, just as a sort of point of defence, it is bizarre. And he, again, I think, Reform have not been on quite the roll that they had been at the start and middle part of the year. And I think performances like that partly explain why, which is that sort of stuff is catnip for the online right. It's catnip for people who love Farage. They go, yeah, Nigel, he's taking him on. Yeah, like, stick it to the BBC. Your average person is going to think he sounds absolutely off his head, right? Talking about these references that already make that from another era, from another age. Lots of people, I take your point, John. I was obviously being flippant when I said everybody was dead. But, a lot of people, particularly younger voters, will not have a clue what he's talking about.
Yeah.
It makes him sound like a drunk uncle at the bar, ranting and raving, rather than engaging with the serious charges that have been put, which he clearly disagrees. And like we said, and I keep saying, I can completely understand, and it is perfectly defensible to be like, yes, I said things that were, I can understand why some people didn't like them, but I never meant them in any kind of harsh way. I was just a kid. Come on, I was just having a joke. That's not what he's doing. He's going on the attack, and he's done it in this extraordinary way, which has made him look, charitably put, deeply eccentric.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.